My wife cheated on me at an adult Halloween costume party, and when I walked into the room, I saw her dressed as a cat being satisfied by my friend in a dinosaur costume on top of her. I'll tell you the story from the beginning. I remember the invitation arriving on a Monday. A bright orange card slipped in with the bills and flyers. Annual Halloween Masquerade Parade. It read, hosted by none other than Mark and Linda. They were our closest friends, the kind you could call on any time of the day and know they'd be there. Mark and I had met back in college, a couple of overconfident, wide-eyed guys who had somehow managed to navigate life alongside each other through every messy chapter. My wife, Sarah, and Linda had clicked from the start. They were like sisters, finishing each other's sentences and giggling like schoolgirls over lunch dates and shared texts. Mark and Linda's Halloween bash was always the highlight of our social calendar. And this year, it was supposed to be bigger than ever, set against the backdrop of a historic mansion they had rented, with a masquerade theme added to the usual flair. I still remember how Sarah's face lit up when she saw the invite. Halloween was her holiday. She loved the makeup, the costumes, the mischief of it all. It was her yearly tradition to go all out, and this year was no exception. "We have to go all out," she said, grinning, eyes sparkling with excitement. "Anything you want, babe," I replied, loving that joy she always brought to the simplest things. We'd been married for nearly 10 years, and I could say that I knew her well enough to trust her excitement. The kids were off with my parents for the weekend, and Sarah had gone on a shopping spree to find the perfect costumes. She refused to tell me what we were going as, saying it would ruin the surprise. She emerged from the closet the night before in a sleek red dress with a mask to match, holding up a tuxedo for me to wear. Apparently, we were going as a couple from some mystery novel she'd read years ago, two masked lovers with a hidden agenda. The night of the party, we arrived hand in hand. The mansion was everything Linda had promised, a sprawling, Gothic estate with tall, arched windows that glowed from within, casting eerie shadows onto the lawn. Fog machines poured out clouds around our feet as we walked toward the front door, where costumed guests milled about, faces obscured by masks. The thrill in Sarah's eyes was contagious, and for a moment, I felt transported back to the early days of our marriage when everything felt new and unexplored. Inside, the place was alive with laughter, music, and the kind of free-spirited fun only a Halloween masquerade can bring. The air was thick with mystery, each guest playing their part, slipping in and out of character. Sarah was practically in her element, mingling with the crowd, tugging me along to introduce me to people she thought were dressed too well to ignore. I remember looking around the dimly lit room, feeling at ease, safe among friends, with Sarah beside me. As the evening wore on, Mark caught up with me. He had dressed up as some 19th-century vampire, complete with a high collar and blood-red cape. "Hey man," he said, pulling me aside. "I need a hand with something out back." I gave Sarah's hand a quick squeeze and assured her I'd be right back. She smiled, shooing me away with a laugh, her attention already captured by another friend she'd spotted across the room. I remember glancing back once, watching her sip her drink, laughing under that mask, and feeling a warm sense of contentment. Out back, Mark and I handled some minor setup detail that Linda had forgotten about. The whole thing took less than 15 minutes, but as we were wrapping up, my phone buzzed. It was my mother texting about the kids, something about bedtime schedules. I excused myself and stepped into the quiet of the hallway inside to make a quick call. As I finished up and turned to head back to the main party, I felt a strange pang of apprehension. Nothing was out of place, yet a chill had settled over me, as if something just wasn't right. It was probably the ambience, the creaking floors, flickering candlelight, the half-drunken laughs echoing down the corridors. But it was more than that. I shook it off and walked back toward the room, hoping to find Sarah where I'd left her. Except she wasn't there. I scanned the room, weaving through guests with half-glimpses of masks and the playful banter of people in character. I looked for her red dress, for the glint of her gold mask in the candlelight, but it was as if she had vanished. My mind ran through a dozen scenarios. She was probably on the dance floor, or maybe she'd gone to get us more drinks. I checked the bar. No Sarah. The dance floor, empty of anyone wearing red. After a few more laps around the house, I found myself feeling a little foolish. She was my wife. I was sure she was safe. Still, the sense of unease wouldn't leave. Finally, I decided to check upstairs, where Linda had mentioned they'd set up a smaller lounge area for people who wanted to relax away from the main crowd. The hallway upstairs was dim, lined with flickering candles, and the sound of music was muted here, a distant throb echoing from below. I felt out of place, like an intruder, as I made my way down, peering into the rooms I passed. And then, I saw it. Through the cracked door at the end of the hall, I caught sight of red, the unmistakable red of Sarah's dress. My breath caught, and for a moment, I was frozen, staring at that sliver of crimson in the dark. My heart hammered in my chest as I quietly pushed the door open just a little more, enough to see. It took a second for my mind to process what I was seeing, for the pieces to connect. The dim light, the soft laughter, the hand resting on Sarah's back, the way she leaned into someone else's touch. I recognized the man before I even fully registered his face. It was Mark, my best friend, my college buddy, the one person I trusted with everything, there with his hand on my wife in a way that left no room for confusion. I backed away, struggling to breathe, 1,000 thoughts tangling in my mind. They didn't see me. They were too caught up in each other. A twisted sense of disbelief filled me. There was no mistaking the way they were looking at each other, no excuse for what I was witnessing. I felt the world spinning, the walls of that dark hallway closing in as the reality of it sank into my gut like a weight. I was about to turn and leave when a soft laugh, unmistakably Sarah's, stopped me. I couldn't help it. I glanced one last time, just in time to hear her whisper, "I wish you were mine, just for tonight." Her words hit me like a punch, and in that moment, something inside me shattered. I don't remember much about how I left the room, just that I found myself stumbling down the staircase, numb, half hidden behind my mask. The laughter and music below felt like they were coming from miles away. Every sound around me was muffled, buried beneath the sharp echo of Sarah's voice in my mind. Those damning words she'd whispered, words that seared into me with an intensity that made my chest ache. My stomach churned as I reached the bottom of the stairs. I felt like I was losing control, every nerve in my body on fire with rage and disbelief. This was my wife, my best friend, the people I thought I could count on. The room spun as I tried to process it, but nothing made sense. I was still clutching my phone from the call with my mother, the text still open on the screen. A reminder of the life I thought I had just hours ago. A stable life, a happy life, one with a wife who loved me, friends I could trust. But what kind of friend would do that? And what kind of wife? I wanted to go back up there, to rip off my mask and scream at them both, to demand answers for why they'd torn my life apart. But as I looked around at the party, at our friends, at everyone laughing and dancing without a care, I realized that confronting them in the middle of it all would just turn my heartbreak into a public spectacle. I wasn't ready for that, for people's pitying looks, the whispered gossip that would follow. I could barely breathe, let alone figure out what to do next. Instead, I found myself drifting through the crowded room, searching for the back door. I needed air, something to ground me, to wake me up from this nightmare. The chill of the autumn night hit me as I stepped outside, but it wasn't enough to pull me from the daze. I walked down the garden path, past a few other guests mingling under strings of orange lights, and found a secluded bench in a darkened corner. I sank down, clutching my hands together as if they might keep me from coming apart completely. I stared out at the trees, my mind racing. How long had this been going on? Was it a one-time thing, or had they been meeting like this for months, years even? Every shared laugh, every inside joke between them over the years, had it all been a lie? My mind churned with memories, revisiting every moment they'd spent together, trying to see if there had been signs that I'd missed, hints that something more sinister had been growing between them. And then there was Sarah. My Sarah. I'd loved her with everything I had. I wasn't perfect, I knew that. We'd had our fair share of arguments, of difficult times. But I'd always believed we were solid, that whatever came our way, we'd face it together. Now, every promise we'd made, every tender moment we'd shared, felt like a cruel joke. As I sat there, the anger started to creep in, bubbling up beneath the sadness, hot and bitter. They had stolen something from me, something I could never get back. Trust. It wasn't just that they'd been unfaithful. They had destroyed the foundation of my life, shattered my faith in the people closest to me. I wanted to scream, to yell until the pain went away, but the silence of the night swallowed my thoughts, and all I could do was sit there, broken and alone. I don't know how long I sat there, the night growing colder around me. Eventually, the sounds of the party began to fade, the guests gradually leaving until the mansion was mostly quiet. The lights dimmed, and the murmur of voices grew softer. I knew I couldn't sit there forever. Eventually, I'd have to face Sarah, to confront the truth of what I'd seen. Finally, I stood, my legs stiff from the cold. I made my way back inside, each step heavy with dread. The hallways were mostly empty now, a few stragglers left behind, people lingering in small groups, their laughter echoing off the high ceilings. I moved quietly, hoping to avoid running into anyone, until I found myself back in the main room. That's where I saw them, Sarah and Mark, standing together by the bar, their masks gone, their faces close as they talked in hushed tones. A sickening feeling twisted in my stomach as I watched them. They looked casual, like they didn't have a care in the world, like they hadn't just destroyed the life I thought we shared. I stayed hidden in the shadows, my fists clenched, my jaw tight. Part of me wanted to march over and confront them, to force them to explain themselves, to make them admit what they'd done. But another part of me, the part that was still raw, still reeling, held me back. I wasn't ready. Not yet. Then, as if sensing my presence, Sarah glanced in my direction. Her eyes met mine, and for a split second, her face fell, a flicker of guilt flashing in her gaze. She quickly looked away, laughing at something Mark said, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she shifted uncomfortably. She knew. She knew I'd seen, and she was choosing to pretend it hadn't happened, to keep up the lie. That was all I needed to see. I turned and left without a word, slipping out of the mansion and into the cool, silent night. The drive home was a blur, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't control. By the time I pulled into our driveway, the exhaustion had settled in, the weight of what I'd seen pressing down on me until I could barely move. I sat there in the darkness, staring at the empty house, feeling like a stranger in my own life. When Sarah finally came home, it was nearly an hour later. I heard her car in the driveway, the quiet click of the front door as she stepped inside. I didn't move, staying in the darkened living room, hidden in the shadows. She hesitated in the doorway, her eyes scanning the room, and for a moment, I thought she might say something. But instead, she went upstairs, her footsteps soft on the carpet. As I listened to her moving around the house, the anger surged up again, sharper this time, fueled by the sight of her slipping so easily back into our life, as if nothing had happened. I wanted to go up there, to confront her, to demand an explanation. But part of me was afraid of what I'd hear, of the truth she'd finally reveal. I spent the night on the couch, barely sleeping, my mind cycling through 1,000 different scenarios, each one more painful than the last. I felt hollow, stripped of everything that had once grounded me. By the time morning came, I knew that I couldn't let it go. I couldn't pretend it hadn't happened, couldn't keep living in this lie. The next morning, Sarah came down the stairs, looking surprised to find me still in the living room. She wore that same casual smile, her eyes warm, as if she were greeting me after a perfectly normal night. "Good morning," she said, her voice cheerful, like nothing had happened. I stared at her, searching for any hint of remorse, any sign that she regretted what she'd done. But her face was a mask, calm and composed, a performance she perfected over who knew how many nights. "Did you have fun at the party?" she asked, pouring herself a cup of coffee. My throat tightened, the words catching in my mouth, but I forced them out. "I saw you with Mark." The smile froze on her face, her eyes widening just a fraction, before she quickly looked down, stirring her coffee as if she hadn't heard me. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. But I wasn't going to let her slip away that easily. I stepped closer, forcing her to look at me, to see the hurt she'd caused. "You know exactly what I'm talking about, Sarah. I saw you with him last night. Upstairs. She looked away, her face pale, her hands trembling as she set down her cup. For a moment, she seemed like she might say something, might offer some kind of explanation. But instead, she just stood there, silent, unable to meet my gaze. In that silence, I felt the last pieces of my heart break. For a long time, we stood there in silence, the unspoken truth hanging between us like a thick fog. Sarah looked down, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. I wanted her to say something, anything that might explain why she'd done this, why she'd taken our life together and ripped it apart in one reckless, unforgivable act. But she just stood there, pale and quiet, a stranger in the body of the woman I'd loved for nearly a decade. Why, Sarah? My voice broke as I forced the question out, hoping for a glimpse of the woman I thought I knew. Her eyes darted to mine, and for a moment, something flickered there. A spark of guilt, maybe even shame. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but then closed it again, her gaze dropping back to the floor. I don't know, she whispered finally, her voice so soft I barely heard it. I never meant to hurt you. I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. You never meant to hurt me? Sarah, I walked into that room last night and saw you with him. Do you have any idea what that did to me? How could you do this? Her shoulders sagged, and she looked away, as if the weight of her own guilt was finally pressing down on her. I don't know. Mark was there when I needed someone. And it just happened. Just happened? I repeated, my voice laced with anger. You don't just fall into someone else's arms, Sarah. This wasn't some mistake. You chose this. She flinched at my words, her face twisting in pain, but I couldn't stop. The anger was spilling out, too strong to hold back. I trusted you. I trusted him. Do you understand what you've done? I know, she whispered, her voice trembling. I know, and I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you, I swear. Things got so complicated. I felt my patience fraying. What's complicated about staying loyal to your husband? Her eyes flashed with something. Anger, maybe, or frustration. It's not that simple, she said, her voice rising slightly. You think this just happened out of nowhere? You think I wanted to feel this way? I stared at her, stunned. Feel what way? Like betraying your husband? Is that really how you felt? She looked away, hugging herself as if trying to shield herself from the weight of her own confession. I don't know. Sometimes it just felt like you didn't see me anymore. Like I was just there. The accusation hit me hard, like a slap. Was she really trying to make this about me? About my shortcomings as a husband? The sheer gall of it left me speechless. Are you saying this is my fault? I asked, my voice low, struggling to keep my anger in check. She shook her head, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. No, I'm not saying that. But sometimes, it felt like you were more focused on everything else. Work, the kids, all these little routines. Like I was just a part of the background. I took a step back, reeling from her words. I had always been there, hadn't I? I had worked hard, yes, but I had done it for us, for our family. And now she was using my commitment to our life as an excuse? So what? I said bitterly. While I was working to keep this family going, you decided it was easier to find comfort in someone else's arms. That's how you show me I matter to you. Her face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks. But instead of filling me with sympathy, her tears only stoked the anger building inside me. She didn't get to play the victim here. She didn't get to cry. I'm sorry, she choked out, reaching toward me, but I took a step back, refusing to let her touch me. Don't, I said sharply. Don't try to make this about us, about things being complicated. You made a choice. You betrayed me, and you betrayed our marriage. She let her hand drop, her expression one of helpless sorrow. I know I did, and I don't expect you to forgive me. I didn't want it to end this way. Those words hung in the air, thick and heavy with finality. The way she looked at me told me everything I needed to know, that deep down, she'd already accepted that our marriage was over. She just didn't have the courage to say it out loud. So, what happens now? I asked, my voice hollow, dreading the answer. She looked away, her hands twisting together. I don't know, she whispered. I never thought it would come to this. I never thought you'd find out. I laughed bitterly, the irony not lost on me. She wasn't sorry for what she'd done. She was sorry she'd been caught. It was like a knife twisting in my gut, the final confirmation that everything I'd believed in, everything I trusted, was gone. I didn't wait for her to continue. The truth was, I couldn't stand to be around her anymore, to look at the face that had betrayed me. Without a word, I turned and walked out, grabbing my jacket and car keys on the way. She called after me, her voice laced with panic, but I didn't stop. I needed to get out, to escape the walls that felt like they were closing in on me, suffocating me with memories of a life that had never really been mine. I drove aimlessly, the streets passing by in a blur as I struggled to process everything that had happened. Every corner I turned, every streetlight I passed, brought with it a flood of memories. All the moments I'd spent with Sarah, building a life together, believing that we were stronger than anything life could throw at us. It all felt like a cruel joke now, like a story someone else had written, one that I had been foolish enough to believe. Eventually, I found myself at the edge of town, parked in front of the small diner where Sarah and I had gone on our first date. The lights inside cast a warm glow, the kind that always made me feel welcome, safe. But tonight, the sight of it only brought a fresh wave of pain. This was where it had all started, the place where I'd first looked into her eyes and thought I'd found my future. I sat there, staring at the diner, memories crashing over me. I thought about our wedding, the promises we'd made, the laughter we'd shared. I thought about our kids, about the life we'd built together, and the hollow ache in my chest grew, threatening to consume me. How had it come to this? How had the woman I'd loved, the woman I'd trusted more than anyone, turned into a stranger right before my eyes? The phone buzzed in my pocket, startling me. I pulled it out, half expecting to see Sarah's name on the screen, but instead, it was Mark. I stared at his name, my heart pounding. I didn't know what he could possibly want, but a surge of anger flared up inside me. I wasn't sure I could face him, not after what I'd seen, not after the betrayal I was still struggling to comprehend. The phone buzzed again, and this time, I answered, my voice cold and steady. What do you want, Mark? There was a pause on the other end, as if he hadn't expected me to pick up. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost pleading. Look, man, I don't know how to even begin to say this. I messed up. I know I did. I'm sorry. I clenched my jaw, barely able to keep my anger in check. Sorry? Is that all you have to say to me? After what you did? He took a shaky breath, his voice filled with regret. I don't know what else to say. I wasn't thinking. It just happened. Just happened. I repeated, my voice dripping with contempt. Funny how things just happen, isn't it? You destroyed my marriage, Mark. You destroyed everything. His voice cracked, desperation seeping through the line. I know, and I hate myself for it. I don't know why I let it go so far. I don't know why I don't know what came over me. But please, man, I'm sorry. I laughed bitterly, the sound hollow and cold. You're sorry? That's supposed to make this better? You took everything from me, Mark. You took my wife, my trust. And you think a simple apology is going to fix that? There was silence on the other end, and I could almost picture him, standing there, helpless, unable to undo the damage he'd caused. But his silence only fueled my anger. I didn't want his apologies. I wanted my life back. I wanted the people I loved to be the ones I thought I knew. Without another word, I hung up, tossing the phone onto the passenger seat. The anger, the sadness, the betrayal, it was all crashing over me, too much to bear. I sat there, staring out at the darkened street, feeling as if I were stranded, adrift in a sea of shattered dreams and broken promises. I had no idea what I would do next, but one thing was clear. My life would never be the same again. The next few days passed in a haze. I kept to the guest room, barely speaking to Sarah, the weight of our shattered marriage hanging heavy between us. The house felt like a prison now, every corner haunted by memories I couldn't escape. I'd catch glimpses of Sarah, eyes red-rimmed, face pale, as she went about her day. She tried to talk to me, to start some conversation, but the pain and anger held me back, closing off every chance of communication. I couldn't shake the image of her with Mark, the memory so vivid it left a bitter taste in my mouth every time I thought of it. Nights became my enemy. Lying in bed, I would stare at the ceiling, sleep slipping further away as my mind replayed every moment, dissected every detail. The betrayal gnawed at me, leaving me hollow, drained of every ounce of the love I'd once felt for her. On the fourth night, I finally confronted her again, unable to bear the silence any longer. She was sitting at the kitchen table, fingers wrapped around a cold mug of tea, staring at nothing. I pulled out a chair across from her, and she looked up, her eyes widening in surprise. The room was dim, only the light above the sink casting a weak glow over us. "We need to talk," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but firm. She nodded, her face etched with sorrow, as if she had aged overnight. "I know." For a moment, neither of us spoke. I wanted her to speak first, to somehow explain herself in a way that would make all of this make sense. But when the silence stretched on, I realized she was waiting for me. "Why, Sarah?" I asked, the words heavy with the weight of days spent in anguish. "Why him? Why do this to us?" Her eyes filled with tears, and she looked down, unable to meet my gaze. "I don't know how to explain it," she said finally, her voice breaking. "Mark, he was there. I was feeling lost, and he listened." I felt a fresh wave of anger rise up. So I'm to blame for this too? Because I was here every day, working, building our life together? Is that why you felt lost? "No," she said quickly, shaking her head. "It wasn't that. It was never about you not being enough, or not being there. I know how hard you work, how much you do for us. But I felt invisible, like I was just a part of the routine. I can't explain it well. I got lost in it all." I clenched my fists, struggling to keep my anger in check. "And you think that justifies everything? Throwing away everything we built, everything we shared. For what? For some meaningless fling?" She flinched, her face crumpling as she wiped away a tear. "It wasn't meaningless to me, not then. I was weak. I was selfish. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't know how to fix this." I looked at her, studying her face, the face I'd loved for so long. How many years had I spent trusting her implicitly, never once doubting her loyalty? And now, all of that was gone, washed away in a single moment. "You can't fix this, Sarah," I said, my voice cold, unrecognizable even to myself. "There's no fixing what you've done." She nodded, her face pale, her hands trembling. "I know." A painful silence filled the room, and I felt as if I were suffocating, drowning in the remnants of the life we'd once had. The memories we'd shared, the laughter, the love, all of it felt tainted now, tainted by the betrayal that had shattered everything. "I think you should leave," I said finally, the words surprising even me. Her face fell, and I saw the fear in her eyes, but I knew it was the only way. I couldn't continue living under the same roof, couldn't bear the daily reminders of the love we'd lost. She opened her mouth to protest, but then she stopped, her face crumpling as she realized I was serious. "Where will I go?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I looked away, unable to answer. "I don't know, but you can't stay here, Sarah. Not after what you've done." She nodded slowly, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of her guilt was finally too much to bear. She looked defeated, broken, and for a moment, I felt a pang of pity, but it was quickly swallowed up by the anger, by the pain that still burned in my chest. Can I at least stay until the weekend?" she asked, her voice trembling. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "Fine, but after that, I don't want to see you here." She nodded, her eyes filling with tears as she looked at me, a silent plea hidden in her gaze. But I couldn't offer her anything, couldn't give her the forgiveness she seemed to be searching for. Not after everything that had happened. The next few days were agonizing. Sarah stayed mostly in the guest room, keeping her distance as we navigated the uneasy silence that had settled over the house. I focused on practical matters, things I could control, packing up her things, making arrangements to have the locks changed, setting up an appointment with a lawyer. The mechanics of moving on provided a small sense of control, a way to channel the pain into something productive. But the nights were the worst, the silence of the house closing in around me like a dark cloud, suffocating and inescapable. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every memory, every moment we'd shared. The betrayal felt like a festering wound, one that no amount of time seemed to heal. Finally, the weekend arrived. Sarah had packed her things, filling the suitcase with the life we'd once shared. I watched her, silent and numb, as she moved through the house, avoiding my gaze, her face etched with regret. "I'll go now," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. She hesitated, looking at me as if searching for something, some sign that I might still care. But I was empty, hollow. The love I'd once felt buried beneath layers of anger and pain. "Goodbye, Sarah," I said, my voice cold, final. She nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears as she turned and walked out the door. I stood there, watching her leave, feeling a strange sense of finality settle over me. This was it, the end of our life together, the end of everything I'd once held dear. As the door closed behind her, a heavy silence filled the house. I sank down onto the couch, the weight of everything finally crashing over me. I was alone, left with nothing but the memories of a love that had once been real, now tainted by betrayal. The silence grew heavier, wrapping around me like a shroud, and I felt the tears begin to fall, hot and bitter. I didn't try to stop them, didn't try to hold back the pain that had been building inside me. I had lost everything, the woman I loved, the life we'd built, the trust that had once been so solid. And as I sat there, alone in the darkened house, I realized that I was truly, irrevocably alone. The days after Sarah left were a blur. The emptiness of the house weighed down on me, a reminder of everything I'd lost. Each room seemed to echo with memories, fragments of the life we'd built together, and the silence felt heavier than ever. I couldn't shake the numbness that had settled over me, as if a part of me had shut down, too tired to process the mess left in the wake of her betrayal. Work became my refuge. I threw myself into it, filling my days with endless tasks, long hours, anything to keep my mind occupied. I would leave before dawn and come back only when exhaustion finally forced me to call it a night. But no matter how late I came home, the silence was always waiting, lurking like a shadow in the corners of every room. My friends had noticed the change, of course. They'd been gentle about it, offering their sympathy, inviting me to dinner, drinks, anything to keep me from sinking further into isolation. I appreciated the gestures, but each invitation reminded me that Sarah was gone, that the life I'd once shared with her was over. And the last thing I wanted was to sit around a table, pretending everything was fine. It was Mark who surprised me the most. I hadn't expected to hear from him, especially after the last conversation we'd had. But 2 weeks after Sarah left, he called. I almost didn't answer, but a part of me, the part that wanted closure, that needed answers, picked up. "Hey," he said, his voice hesitant, laced with a shame I could almost feel through the phone. "What do you want, Mark?" I asked, my voice cold, distant. He sighed, a weary sound, like he'd been carrying his own burden of guilt. "Look, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, and I don't expect you to forgive me, but I couldn't let things end like that, without explaining." I stayed silent, my mind racing through the events of the past few weeks, the anger simmering just below the surface. But I let him continue, waiting for the words I hadn't known I needed to hear. "I'm not here to make excuses," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I messed up. I hurt you, and I know I can't take that back. But I need you to understand that I never set out to betray you. I never wanted this to happen." "Then why did it?" I asked, the anger spilling into my voice, sharp and unyielding. "If you didn't want it to happen, then why did you let it? Why didn't you stop?" He hesitated, the silence stretching between us, and I could hear the guilt in his voice when he finally spoke. "I don't know. I was weak. Lonely. Maybe. But that's not an excuse. I don't know how to explain it, Rob. I lost sight of everything that mattered. And by the time I realized what I was doing, it was too late. I clenched my jaw, fighting the urge to hang up. But there was something in his voice, a rawness that made me hesitate. Do you love her? I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. The line went silent, and for a moment, I thought he might not answer. But then he spoke, his voice low, filled with regret. No, I don't. It wasn't. It wasn't about love. It was a mistake, Rob. A terrible, selfish mistake. I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. A mistake that cost me everything. He exhaled slowly, the sound filled with sorrow. I know, and I'll carry that with me for the rest of my life. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed you to know that I'm sorry. Truly, deeply sorry. I didn't know how to respond. The anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but there was a strange, twisted comfort in hearing him say the words I'd longed to hear. It didn't change what he'd done, didn't erase the pain, but it was something. I don't know if I can forgive you, Mark, I said finally, my voice cold, distant. Maybe someday, but not now. I understand, he said softly, his voice laced with regret. If you ever need anything, Rob, anything at all, I'll be here. I'll do whatever I can to make this right. I didn't respond, and eventually, he hung up, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The call left me feeling hollow, as if the final piece of my anger had drained away, leaving only a dull, aching emptiness. I knew that no amount of apologies could fix what had happened. No words could bring back the trust, the love that had been destroyed. Days turned into weeks, and I slowly began to rebuild my life. I started going out with friends again, accepting their invitations, letting them drag me out of the suffocating silence that had become my existence. It was a slow, painful process, but little by little, I began to feel like myself again, like a version of me that could survive without Sarah, without the life we'd once shared. One night, a few months later, I found myself back at the same diner where Sarah and I had gone on our first date. I hadn't planned to go there. I just wandered in after a long day at work, the familiar setting a strange comfort in the wake of everything that had happened. I sat in a booth by the window, watching the world go by, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over me. I ordered a coffee, letting the warmth seep into my hands as I stared out at the street, my mind drifting. For the first time in months, I felt at peace, as if I'd finally accepted the reality of my new life. The memories still lingered, but they no longer held the same power over me, no longer filled me with the raw, aching pain that had once been all-consuming. As I sat there, I realized that I was ready to move on, to let go of the past and start building something new. It wouldn't be easy, and I knew there would be days when the pain would resurface, when the memories would creep back in. But I was ready to face it, to rebuild my life one step at a time. The waitress brought over my coffee, and I thanked her with a small smile, feeling a sense of closure settle over me. For the first time since the night of the Halloween party, I felt like I could breathe again, like I could see a future beyond the pain and betrayal. I took a sip of the coffee, savoring the warmth, the familiarity. The world outside moved on, indifferent to the scars I carried, but I was no longer haunted by them. I'd found a strange, unexpected strength in the aftermath of everything that had happened, a resilience I hadn't known I possessed. And as I sat there, staring out at the bustling street, I knew that I would be okay. It wouldn't be easy, and the scars would remain, but I would survive. I would rebuild. Because in the end, life goes on. Subscribe to the channel, and like this story if you liked it. Turn on notifications so you don't miss new stories. Click on the playlist on the right to listen to previous stories. See you soon.